When you think of the richest country in Asia, which one pops in your mind? China, Qatar, or the United Arab Emirates? Although these are top-ranked, one name stands out despite being smaller than these, with a fast-growing economy. It's none other than Singapore. You will be shocked to learn that in 2023, the GDP per capita of Singapore is $91.1 thousand, which is even higher than the United States of America itself. The Economist says Singapore has an impressive economic record. For reference, the median wage for Singaporean residents in full-time work has risen by 43%, compared with an 8% rise in America. Now, a common question arises. How did this small Asian nation become so rich? Well, during Singapore's independence in the 1960s, it was surrounded by hostile nations and had no natural resources, while its population lived in dire conditions in slums. But that's not the scenario you get to witness in this day and age. How did Singapore succeed? And what's the secret behind Singapore's robust economic position today? Let's get straight into shedding light on the factors that contributed to Singapore's success, from its backstory to it becoming so rich and developed. Just off Malaysia's coast, Singapore stands as a city-state that has amazed the global business scene. Until recently, the World Bank named it the easiest place to do business, though New Zealand has snatched that crown out of nowhere. Still, Singapore's silver medal is no small feat, we must say. This tiny island nation, with limited land and moderate population, has become Southeast Asia's finance and trade powerhouse that can't be trifled with. What's fascinating is how Singapore got here. Its economic story is a roller coaster, which roots back to over 200 years ago with British colonial reigns. If you turn the pages of history, you will figure out how Singapore transformed into the economic wonder it is today. Looking back to 1819, the British established a trading post at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. Their motive was to transform it into a key stopover for the British East India Company's Southeast Asian trade. This led to the rise of Singapore as a significant seaport. However, the port city truly flourished 50 years later with the opening of the Suez Canal. This canal connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, which dramatically boosted trade to Southeast Asia and doubled the trade volume passing through Singapore. For a century, Singapore worked as a prosperous British outpost, much like Hong Kong. But the political scene changed in 1957 when Malaysia gained independence from Britain. In 1965, Singapore followed suit and broke away from Malaysia. While independence was the trend of the time and marked a new chapter for Singapore, it also meant losing a huge portion of its lands that would have been a prerequisite for the initial prosperity. Up until then, Singapore had functioned as a mini England in Southeast Asia and relied on its colonial ties for stability and growth. This is when the challenges were thrown to a country like Singapore. International companies and shipping organizations had more faith in operating their businesses under the British rule for their vast stability than that of a micronation like Singapore. Since Singapore faced high unemployment and poor living conditions, the new government decided to change things. They focused on boosting the economy by improving education and investing in productive projects for their people. At the same time, they attracted foreign investors by keeping business regulations fair and reasonable. If we talk about Singapore's success story, you have to take foreign investment into account on a large scale. Why? Its cause, over 70% of its total output comes from foreign companies, especially in banking, shipping, and oil industries. Singapore became an attractive location for these industries for several unique reasons. But the scenario was different before. Just a few years after independence, many feared that the People's Action Party might nationalize foreign investments. This would have made businesses hesitant to invest. However, Singapore has since established itself as a secure and reliable center for investment in the region. So, the good news for investors is they no longer need to worry about instability or aggressive nationalization. Instead, they consider Singapore incredibly safe for foreign businesses and a well-established economy. Singapore also attracts multinationals for favorable taxation and banking privacy laws. As Asia's economy expanded, the region needed a financial center point similar to Switzerland, and luckily, Singapore fit the bill perfectly. Its strategic location at the crossroads of major shipping routes enhanced, which connected Asia's rising economic powers with the West. These factors attracted massive foreign investments, which resulted in the glass skyscrapers that you will spot in the Singapore cityscape today. This inflow of foreign capital was no accident. It was part of a well-thought-out plan by the Singaporean government. Singapore did not stop at that point. Their government concentrated on investing to educate its citizens and develop productive infrastructure. They knew very well that as a small nation, Singapore couldn't rely on raw economic production. Instead, it had to be the smart middleman in regional activities. For instance, while Singapore couldn't compete as a major oil producer due to its limited land, it could excel in refining oil. And today, Singapore is often listed as one of the world's top 3 oil trading and refining hubs, with a total crude oil refining capacity of 1.5 million barrels per day. Singapore also realized that its domestic service sector alone couldn't sustain wealth with a small population. So, it became a neutral base of operations for financial service companies throughout Southeast Asia. Another major concern was Singapore's limited potential as a tourist destination. Despite its natural beauty, food scene, and diverse culture, Singapore couldn't become a travel destination overnight. But there was a window of opportunity here. Now suppose you're off to Australia for your undergraduate studies. While flying to Melbourne, you will most likely have a transit in Changi Airport, one of the most beautiful airports in the world. Guess where it is? Singapore. It's also ranked second among the best airports in the world in 2024. So you see what Singapore did? It basically turned this country into a global stopover for travelers to move between major international countries: China, Japan, India, Australia, and the Middle East. Moving on to the service sector. In reality, much of the global economy now relies on the service sector. Think about your own job. Does it primarily involve handling information and managing services? For many people, the answer is yes. The rise of Singapore as a successful intermediary demonstrates how crucial service industries have become in the modern economy. For example, let's take a look at this data from Statista. In 2023, the export of transport services in Singapore amounted to around 141.34 billion Singapore dollars. This made it the largest services sector export after other business services. Financial services followed closely behind, with an export value of around 58.61 billion Singapore dollars. Singapore's decision to position itself as a facilitator rather than a producer has proven advantageous, establishing it as a model for economic ideologies. At first glance, Singapore's economy seems straightforward. You will view it as a small nation filled with banks, trade ports, low taxes, and aspiring Goldman Sachs interns. All of it makes it a capitalist wonderland. However, the reality is more complex than you might assume. If you look at the societal point of view, Singapore is a well-rounded combination of capitalist and socialist policies. On the capitalist side, it offers very low income tax rates, with the highest bracket at around 22% for the highest earners. And even then, few actually pay that much. Despite this, the government still collects taxes, but in targeted areas. For instance, Singapore imposes heavy taxes on car ownership. What's the reason behind it? Well, as a small yet densely populated urban nation, it faces challenges with congestion and pollution. That is one of the reasons why the government makes car ownership expensive to discourage its use. Secondly, this system actually helps promote public transport, which is beneficial both financially and environmentally. Now, this is something you call a perfect mix of free market economy with strategic government interventions wherever it's necessary. On top of that, Singapore avoids being a strict authoritarian state by not banning cars. Instead, it addresses the issue with a capitalist twist. In Singapore, cars are very expensive. For reference, a sedan typically costs around 120,000 Singaporean dollars, while a small SUV costs 135,000 Singaporean dollars, and a luxury car can set you back around 190,000 Singaporean dollars. Well, it's not due to import tariffs or currency issues, but because of the registration system. The government uses a system of limited issue licenses, registration and checks, which can make a base model Honda Civic cost over $114,000. Whereas, if you look at the similar model is the US, it retails for below $30,000. That is exorbitant, isn't it? Rather than banning cars, the government made a rule. They stated one can have a car if they are a highly productive member of society. This approach clearly means that if you want a car for yourself, you need to work hard. And the income generated from car registrations is invested back into developing public transport infrastructure. On a brighter side, this reduces the need for people to own cars, which is an efficient solution to lessen urban congestion and pollution. Singapore's management of supply and demand to promote public transport usage, combined with thoughtful application of governmental principles and strategic socialist policies, enhances its appeal as a business-friendly destination. Contrary to what some might think, a pure capitalist economy with no regulations would be detrimental, even for established businesses. They rely on government intervention to maintain common goods, protect property, uphold contracts, and ensure a stable population to engage in commerce. Singapore has achieved national success, not only due to its advantageous location and opportune timing, but also through deliberate efforts, despite its scarcity of arable land and natural resources. Singapore's government implemented the right mix of economic policies for the right reasons. Now that we have an idea of how Singapore's government transformed the country, let's compare it to other places in the world. For example, if you compare this tiny island nation's size to the vivacious New York City, it's actually smaller than that, despite being one of Asia's wealthiest and one of the world's richest countries. Besides, its GDP per capita surpasses that of the UK, US, and France. In this regard, visual capitalists said that Singapore is the #1 country in all of Asia with GDP per capita of 91, $1K as of 2023. And Singapore proudly grabs the #5 spot in the world, right behind Luxembourg, Ireland, Norway, and Switzerland. Like we already mentioned, over the past 60 years, Singapore has evolved from a colonial trading post into a financial hub to gain global admiration. It inspires the countries that aim to develop strong, high-tech economies. Singapore's prosperity comes from decades of careful planning by its ruling party. The nation's success is built on strategic economic policies and investments in infrastructure, education, and technology. With its first leadership change in 20 years, Singapore's capability to maintain economic growth is set to strengthen even further. Lee Kuan Yew was the first Prime Minister of Singapore from 1959 to 1990. He is also called the founding father of the country. By nature, he was a brilliant statesman and highly regarded visionary, who successfully transformed the island nation into an economic powerhouse. When Singapore gained independence in 1965, Lee Kuan Yew and his colleagues confronted a harsh economic reality. The nation had no natural resources. They decided to develop the manufacturing sector, aiming to turn the country into an export-driven economy and attract foreign investment. Singapore's strategic position along shipping routes, including the Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea, further supported their efforts. This provided a significant advantage in this case. At first, Singapore focused on labor-intensive industries to tackle high unemployment rates. However, Lee viewed manufacturing as just a starting point for creating a more advanced economy. He set up a solid financial and legal framework to ensure stable and transparent governance, and invested in better public transport and healthcare infrastructure. In the 1980s, Lee started focusing more on finance, as it seemed more crucial for Singapore's economy. He made financial services rules less strict, for which he took inspiration from the US and UK. These changes still influence Singapore today, which helped make it a top spot for over 4,200 multinational companies. About tax rate, Singapore's corporate tax rate is 17%, which can go as low as 13.5% for certain activities. This lower percentage of corporate tax also helps attract businesses worldwide. Following Lee Kuan Yew's footsteps, his successor Goh Chok Tong continued Singapore's focus on attracting large businesses. He was the second Prime Minister of Singapore from 1990 to 2004. Under his leadership, the country shifted towards a knowledge-based economy to emphasize creativity and nurture local entrepreneurs. Lee Kuan Yew's son, Lee Hsien Loong, also joined in to recognize the importance of making Singapore a place for economic growth. Given its strategic location, Singapore was determined to turn into a desirable destination. By the 1970s, Singapore's success in extensive land reclamation efforts was visible. This initiative helped transform reclaimed land into spaces for offices, residential buildings, and entertainment spots. Besides that, Singapore introduced initiatives like the F1 night race at the Marina Bay Street Circuit from 2008. It was a milestone event for F1 racing, as the Grand Prix was the first F1 night race and the first to be held on a street circuit in Asia. Such moves coincided with the growth of economies in China and India, which helped Singapore attract affluent individuals from across the region. Under Lee Hsien Loong's leadership, Singapore saw an increase in assets under management. The amount soared from $420 billion to a whopping $3.6 trillion by 2022. Like every developed nation has some downsides, Singapore is no exception. Despite its economic achievements, Singapore's government faces criticism for its constraints on civil liberties and media freedom. However, Lee Kuan Yew prioritized Singapore's integrity over press freedom to maintain social cohesion and stability in economic growth. During Lee Kuan Yew's period of leadership, Singapore was criticized for inducing fear among citizens to openly criticize the government. This trend continued under subsequent administrations, which included the prohibition of protests. Today, Singapore's demographic scene has become more diverse and vocal. The government realizes the need to balance social cohesion with maintaining competitiveness globally. Additionally, addressing climate change is also crucial for national security. Today, Lawrence Wong, the Prime Minister in 2024, inherits a nation shaped by these dynamics. He is recognized for his background in public housing and his commendable management of the COVID-19 crisis. He contemplates the importance of building upon Singapore's existing strengths and reinforcing successful policies. Now, let's talk about a few apparent struggles of Singapore. In the years ahead, wealth accumulation introduced new challenges, such as rising housing costs and increased living expenses. Also, Singapore's growth strategy has involved attracting foreign labor. But there have been concerns that these workers are occupying too many coveted positions. While statistical data indicates a reduction in inequality, many residents see disparities differently. Aside from that, this country also struggles with an aging population. It will strain workforce growth and government expenditures at the same time. Lawrence Wong must address these issues to sustain the city-state's hard-won achievements and societal discontent. After knowing so much about this country by now, don't you wonder how many people actually live there? Singapore has over 5.6 million people as of 2023. Taking their small workforce for granted won't be wise, as Singapore provides an economic output of $500 billion. This places Singapore in the 33rd position when it comes to ranking the world's largest economy. After going through a poverty-stricken journey 5 decades ago, Singapore turned around boldly, and today it leaves behind larger nations like the UAE, Vietnam, and even Malaysia to its north. The remarkable success of this small island has caught the eye of economists and commentators around the world, who regard it as a blueprint for other nations seeking economic prosperity. Various nations across different continents have been dubbed as the Singapore of their region, inspired by Singapore's transformation. However, replicating its success is often much more challenging than it seems. It's hard to imagine how a country with limited natural resources and geopolitical positioning eventually contributed to its economic rise. Such matches are rare and challenging to replicate elsewhere. While many economies aspire to emulate Singapore's path, the exact combination of advantages are not found elsewhere. What this reveals is that there won't be another Singapore in any other part of the world. There is another common misconception. Singapore's success hinges on glamorous industries and gleaming city skyscrapers. It's understandable, given the images of Marina Bay, stories of global billionaires residing there, and portrayals in modern media. But if you look closely enough, you will figure out the reality is quite different. And many economists overlook how Singapore's initial success came into play. There are many questions here, though. If replication is next to impossible, is there any possibility that other economies can learn from it? And can they apply the lessons domestically? What factors contributed to Singapore's exceptional success? And why is it extremely challenging for other nations to replicate? If you raise these questions and try to find the appropriate answers, you will understand Singapore's economic prowess and place it rightfully on the global economic map. Singapore's journey to independence is quite unique. While many nations had to fight hard for their freedom, Singapore was unexpectedly thrust into independence after separating from Malaysia. This was actually a result of its history as a trade port under colonial rule. Following World War II and the Japanese forces, Singapore struggled to rebuild from near devastation. This resembled more of a sprawling slum than a city-state. Singapore was finally cast out from Malaysia in 1965 after recognizing the social strains. The new government adopted benevolent authoritarianism. One of their initial moves was reclaiming extensive tracts of land. They actually got them at lower market rates from private owners so they could build affordable public housing. And the tactic worked out in Singapore's favor. While emulating Singapore's economic model, we might overlook a detail. The thing is, implementing such policies on a large scale in any advanced economy would face political backlash. Housing remains tightly regulated in Singapore, combining centralized planning with a robust free market system. Income taxes in Singapore are relatively low. For reference, from 2024 onward, Singapore will increase the headline personal income tax rate to 24%. Chargeable income between $370,000 to $741,000 will be taxed at 23%, while chargeable income above $741,000 will be taxed at 24%. Simultaneously, a mandatory 20% of workers' salaries is deducted by the government. This gets deposited into a communal investment fund, not for general spending, and this fund enables citizens to make subsidized housing deposits. Employers also contribute an extra 16%, which makes it a total of 36% to support retirement and healthcare expenses from the same fund. So people are required to save a minimum of 36% of their income. If you compare it to the US, Singapore has double the average savings rate. Beyond these mandatory savings, Singaporeans also have diligent saving habits. For instance, the average resident sets aside 54.6% of their earnings. From this, you realize that most people in the country are financially prudent. If you look at the present scenario, The Economist said, Singapore has grown as a financial center and is now often compared to Hong Kong, which was once the clear leader among Asia's global cities. You will be surprised to know that Singapore is surpassing Hong Kong in many ways. Salaries in Singapore are about 50% higher than in Hong Kong. In 2017, Singapore managed $2.4 trillion in assets, which is about 75% of Hong Kong's $3.1 trillion. By 2022, Singapore's assets grew to $3.6 trillion, just 8% less than Hong Kong's. Despite its success, Singapore's policymakers are cautious. They worry about Hong Kong's decline rather than celebrating their own growth. In 2019, during Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests, the Monetary Authority of Singapore denied reports that it was benefiting from capital leaving Hong Kong. And Hong Kong's weakened reputation has made Singapore a more important option for Chinese wealth. Now let's talk about some definitive statistics further. Singapore's financial strength isn't just in the private sector. Temasek, the state-owned investment company, held $287 billion in assets as of March 2023. The Monetary Authority of Singapore manages around $369 billion in foreign exchange reserves, gold, and other assets. The Government of Singapore Investment Corporation keeps its holdings secret, but is estimated to control about $769 billion. This makes it one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, which can only be surpassed by a few oil-rich nations and China's funds. When combined, Singapore's state-owned assets total over 270% of its GDP. These figures portray an economy that saves significantly more than it spends. Singapore also has one of the world's largest current account surpluses. As a small country and close US ally, Singapore avoids the scrutiny that others might face for such high savings and a managed exchange rate. The US has a trade surplus with Singapore, which helps it stay off the radar of American protectionists. However, during Donald Trump's presidency, Singapore was briefly on America's currency manipulation watch list. If Trump wins the next election, Singapore could face renewed attention from US trade officials. Let's get back to talking about Singapore's main industry now. Today, it is very different from the flashy world of global finance. It serves as a refueling stop for cargo ships from around the world. As Asia grew as a center for cheap manufacturing and global trade increased, Singapore built large oil facilities. These facilities bring in oil from places like the South Pacific and Persian Gulf and supply it to ships passing through the busy Malacca Straits. You need to give credits to its strategic location and the steady flow of crude oil tankers. For this reason, Singapore has the world's largest bunkering port and offers lower prices than the Gulf states. Though Singapore produces some oil, which is about 20,000 barrels a day, it's a tiny amount compared to the vast oil volume passing through. As we talked about Singapore's industrial scene already, here's a short recap to appreciate their efforts further. Despite having minimal domestic oil resources, it is one of the world's largest oil trading hubs. Its manufacturing sector is so advanced and significant that it contributes between 20 and 25% to the country's annual GDP. Also, the Department of Statistics Singapore stated that in 2023, over 70% of nominal value added was generated by the services industries, and about 25% was generated by the goods-producing industries. Some of the largest and most prominent companies of Singapore are DBS Group, OCBC Bank, Singtel, Singapore Airlines. And these have the market capitalization of billions of dollars. By the way, Singapore also created the region's largest commodities exchange. This exchange helps companies and traders lock in prices for various resources traded in Asia to strengthen Singapore's position as a maritime trade point. In the mid-1970s, Singapore didn't have the money to compete in the global oil market on its own. But the country wanted to attract multinational oil companies, so it offered profit-sharing deals. These companies needed a good reason to invest in a new and potentially unstable country with little natural oil. Singapore's strategic location was attractive, but experts say what really drew in foreign companies was the stability and security of its one-party government. Another advantage was Singapore's use of an English common law system from its colonial past. This legal system is known for its transparency and fairness in handling business disputes, which makes Singapore a more suitable place for companies to do business. If you assume Singapore's success is just an accidental fluke or simply luck, you have the wrong impression. Singapore smartly reinvested early profits into its people and industries. However, if Singapore were located elsewhere, its achievements might not have been as impressive. Some think other countries can replicate Singapore's success by adopting similar policies, but this is a misconception. Singapore is often admired for its low taxes and minimal business regulations. While its 17% corporate tax rate is competitive, it's not extremely low. Additionally, Singapore has some of the world's highest property taxes and hefty fees for car registration and ownership. So simply copying Singapore's tax and regulatory policies might not lead to the same level of success in other places. In Singapore, people and businesses pay a significant amount of their earnings in taxes, similar to other developed countries. However, Singapore's tax system is different in its structure. Government revenue makes up about 18% of Singapore's GDP, which is similar to the United States. Singapore's small size helps with economic management. Infrastructure and services are concentrated in a compact area, and that helps keep administration costs low. Despite this, some believe Singapore collects more taxes than necessary. Additionally, around 10% of Singapore's workforce commutes daily from Malaysia. This contributes to the economy without being counted in the population. This also inflates metrics like GDP per capita that makes comparisons with other countries less accurate. But yes, you can find its similarity with Luxembourg, where cross-border commuters influence its GDP. Lowering taxes wasn't the only thing that paved the way to Singapore's success. Imagine a small country gaining independence in a favorable region that becomes a global trade center before you know it. If this country then has a trustworthy government that makes decisions without corruption, and if there are no better options until industries are well established, then yes, that country could replicate Singapore's success to an extent. However, this scenario comes with its own set of uncertainties. While it's tempting for developing countries to aspire to Singapore's economic prosperity, there are other examples and strategies that might be more effective. Singapore's economic standing is impressive. With a GDP of $466 billion, it ranks as the 33rd largest economy globally. It easily surpasses regional competitors like Malaysia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and the Philippines. When it comes to Singapore's governance, you have to appreciate it for stability and confidence. The country's long-term leadership has created such an unshakable economic environment that it is hard to replicate without the risks of unchecked political power. Even after that, Singapore is considered to be one of the safest choices for trade and business in its region. Singapore's economic growth has been impressive as it came a long way after recovering from poverty 50 years ago. Over the past 20 years, Singapore's economy has not just doubled in size. As a matter of fact, it quadrupled in size. Not just that, it successfully handled crises such as the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, along with the devastating COVID-19 pandemic. It seems like there's no wrapping up when it comes to Singapore's tremendous success. Singapore's rise to wealth and development is a perfect concoction of strategic location, well-thought-out policies, disciplined governance, consistent industrialization, and more. All in all, the country is exemplary in the world of enormous development for valid reasons. So when are you planning to stop by the island nation of the Malayan to witness it all by yourself? Do share with us. Until next time.